All right, Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. And my guest, here we go. And my guest is Daniel Ortner. He's an attorney with Pacific Legal Foundation, which litigates nationwide to achieve court victories enforcing the Constitution's guarantee of individual liberties. They're California-based. He is the author of an op-ed piece, The Hill, from The Hill, The Slippery Slope of Trying to Curb Extremist Speech. Daniel, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Daniel, this is a very complex issue in that we want to try to curb violent, radical organizations, certainly,
Right.
who from speech. Germany, I think, has certain bans on Nazism,
That's right, yeah.
which, of course, that's not the United States. But at the same time, we want to balance that with the right to express ourselves, even if we find that expression to be wrong.
That's right.
What say you?
Yeah, the founding fathers, when they established the Constitution, erred very strongly on the on the side of allowing speech, even speech that they disagreed with strongly. They had seen for too long, in Europe and elsewhere, wars over ideas, people being killed because they disagreed with each other on religion, on politics. And so they wanted to create a nation where there was a space to disagree with one another, where you could hear ideas that were offensive, even deeply offensive to you, but you could still coexist in a civil society. And so I think the Constitution and the founders' ideal very strongly errs on the side of freedom of speech, even for ideas that we dislike, even for ideas that we might think are radical or dangerous. And ultimately, it's a very difficult line to say what is extreme. Everyone has their own opinion. What you agree with, what you feel passionately about, of course, you see as normal or what everyone should believe, but things you disagree with are viewed as extremist. And so the idea that government should be in the business of saying, well, some ideas are too extreme to be expressed, it is always going to lead to censorship or to lead to some ideas, the favorite ideas being allowed and ideas that people disagree with being disfavored. And that's very contrary to the ideal of the founders.
Now, you mentioned in your article that in the aftermath of the Christchurch shooting at a mosque in New Zealand, there was
Right.
this New Zealand and France drafted a, quote, Christchurch call to action,
Right.
a non-binding resolution that urges greater restriction of, quote unquote, extremist speech and content. And then after the Poway shooting in San Diego at a synagogue, you had not an outright call for a banning of anti-Semitism, but
Right.
something that was kind of pretty close to that when the UN ambassador from Israel made similar comments about cracking down on anti-Semitic speech.
Right.
Look, I'm certainly think, am with you on this in that even though I may find such speech to be despicable, at the same time, I think that trying to ban it is only going to fan the flames. It's only going to be playing into the hands of those who are promoting violence.
Right. I mean, I think really you've seen in Europe, you mentioned Holocaust denial has been illegal since the Second World War. Right-wing speech, Nazism speech has been illegal for decades. And yet the far right in much stronger in Germany than it ever has been in the United States. I think partially because restrictions drive things underground. When things are being censored, it creates a persecution complex, a narrative that the government is persecuting you because your ideas are right and true, and people buy into that kind of a martyrs complex. And so I think that censorship has just not been shown to be an effective tool at combating extremism. But I think more importantly, it really lends itself to arbitrary decisions about what is extreme. Today, those on the left are viewing traditional Christian ideas about marriage as extreme. Pastors have been arrested in Canada and England for preaching from the Bible about homosexuality. On the other hand, in Russia, which is a very conservative country, they ban any pro-homosexual speech and also religious speech that is minority speech under the guise of extremism. And also they ban things like episodes of South Park or The Simpsons because those are offensive or crude or likely to corrupt minors or offend is the idea there. So it's a tool that is used across the world to censor in very dangerous ways. And it's not one that we should be picking up, even though there is a real reason to be afraid of extremism. There is a way to combat action. When you see someone planning violent attacks, you absolutely go after that. When you see incitement to violence, it's like direct incitement to take an act of violence, you can target that. But you narrow that so that you're really not going after speech. You're just going after acts or precipitating speech that leads directly to violence. And so it's a narrow category, and that eliminates the room a little bit for discretion to enter the picture and to go after ideas that we just disagree with and dislike.
Well, I mean, I think that, however, there is some level of regulation of speech. It was Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes who made reference to free speech is fine, except you draw the line at yelling fire in a crowded theater.
Right. Though, of course, he said that
it's illegal
before he
Well,
got, he was at the time was not a very good defender of speech, and he actually had to shift after that point to become a very strong, much stronger defender of speech. So I don't know that he would agree with that principle later in his lifetime when he became a champion of free speech. I mean, the way that the Constitution has defined incitement, is very narrow. It's you have to be actually calling someone directly to engage in a violent action, or you have to be doing fighting words, which are you have to say something directly to someone's face that is going to provoke violence. These are very narrow categories of speech that can be restricted. General, speech that happens to be offensive, even provocative or false, cannot be restricted. And that's really been the consensus in this country since at least the 1950s and until the present on the Supreme Court, is that really these categories of speech that you can restrict are incredibly narrow and not to be expanded. You can't get into the attitude of, well, something is offensive, something is shocking, and therefore we can censor it. That is a dangerous ground to go into.
Right. In other words, what I see here is that there's a difference between censoring illegal, violent advocacy and opinion. And for example, it is illegal to call for the assassination of the president of the United States. And I think anyone else, you cannot go on the media and call for someone to be killed.
There's actually a famous Supreme Court case about that, of someone who threatened to kill Lyndon Johnson, and the Supreme Court said no, that was not a true threat because it wasn't imminent. It wasn't likely to actually cause someone to fear for their life. It was some person far away writing, saying something on a media network, and so we've narrowed that to the point where it's really only if it's a direct threat of harm. You say, I am going to kill you, but not if you indirectly say, I hope someone, violence will happen, or something much less direct. Then we've said, no, that is still protected speech.
And we also regulate pornographic images, and we regulate access to such things for children. So I suppose that you could say that underage people, there's some regulation of speech.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's because I think there's a consensus in society that we want to protect the innocence of children. And it's not, it's in a sense, there's a kind of a fuzzy line in terms of at what point is someone an adult, but that has to do with what is consensual for adults. Like it's illegal for children to smoke cigarettes, or drink. So I think that falls in that area.
I agree. I think it's worth mentioning, though, that it's been interpreted very narrowly in this country. And for instance, there's another Supreme Court case about drive-in or movies being projected in a kind of a town square type setting, and the Supreme Court said no, you cannot censor the types of films that could be played in that setting because of the fear of upsetting children. So there's very narrow protections that have been allowed by the Supreme Court and in this country, and I think there's a good reason for that, because we worry about the government being paternalistic and making restrictions on speech because they think it's unsafe or dangerous or offensive. Really gets you down that line of the government as big brother, as the paternal figure stepping in and telling you what's okay to listen to and what's okay to think. And so we want to avoid that as much as possible. We create very narrow exceptions for very good reason.
All right, Daniel Ortner's my guest. The slippery slope of trying to curb extremist speech. Daniel, in your article, you mentioned that people on the left might want to limit or ban criticisms of such institutions as gay marriage and abortion and other pet causes of theirs. And you contrast that with the fact that in the 1950s, there were bans on advocating communism,
Yeah,
which
that's
of
right.
course then they were super civil libertarian. The difference I see here is that communism sought to overthrow the U.S. government by means of violence. I don't think that is it appropriate to have people or a movement of people who are advocating the overthrow of violence should that be free speech? Should that be allowed?
So I think that the way that we've dealt with this in the past, that I think correctly, is supporting certain groups. So designated groups like the Communist Party of the Russian Communist Party, or Hamas or Hezbollah or Al Qaeda. You cannot support the organizations that are perpetuating acts of violence. But we do not censor the ideas behind them. We do not say, if you believe in communism or if you believe in radical Islam, you are going to be punished for your ideas and your thoughts. And that's, I think, it's a fine line, but I think it's a really important one. If an organization is advocating violence, advocating for the overthrow of the government, advocating for terrorist acts, you can say you cannot send money to that cause. You cannot fund that organization because they are an organization that we have designated as a dangerous one, as a terrorist organization. But you do not censor the ideas or the thinking, or you can write in favor of the communist ideas all you want, as long as you're not sending money to the Communist Party in Russia back in the Cold War era, or today you're sending money to Al Qaeda or sending money to Hamas or providing direct financial aid. That's a really important principle.
In other words, if it's a nation or a group that is actively at war with the United States and deemed
Right.
as such by our government, then you cannot aid and abet their activities.
Right, exactly. But the ideas, the battle of ideas is still allowed. You can still discuss communism or discuss Islam or discuss any ideas or traditional Christian ideas of marriage, any idea, even if it cuts against the consensus, even if it's against, action would be against the law in certain fashion. You say ideas, discussion of those values, discussion of those ideas is permitted. You draw the line at action when it comes to supporting groups that are, as you said, enemies or engaged in active acts of violence.
And I would also suggest that the free speech, when it comes to ideas and movements that are seen as politically incorrect, is critical because, for example, there's a movement among certain Islamic groups like CARE, for example, that want to limit criticism of Islam.
Right.
And they're supported by a lot of people on the left. I would suggest that we should have free speech in terms of criticizing and examining Islam.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let the defenders of Islam come forth and have a reasonable and civil debate on any and all of these issues, and then people will be able to decide. And there's a difference between such debate and acts calling for violence. Again, there's a line that's drawn there. So
absolutely. I mean, the best example I can think of historically is that the abolition movement abolitionism in the United States, abolishing slavery, started as a minority movement, and it was actually censored in the South. You couldn't publish abolitionist material in the Deep South before the Civil War. It was an effort to censor an idea that they thought was dangerous and harmful, but his course of history has shown to be a moral imperative, that slavery was an evil that needed to be abolished. And when you censor ideas, you prevent those good ideas from coming forward. You prevent a real debate. You prevent good true ideas from prevailing ultimately, and that's harmful to society.
Now, there's been a lot of talk recently about the big internet companies, Facebook, YouTube, right, which of course this program is on, Google, and others, in the name of trying to weed out outright terrorists, people
right,
who are sending how to build a bomb, and violent activists. They have veered into the area of censoring speech and organizations that are deemed as quote unquote hate groups,
right,
by this group called the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is very biased by any standards, and which has been given this platform to decide who's what's a hate group, and that includes people like Dennis Prager. He's a rabbi, right, who's teaches conservative values. Apparently, his work, he's in a lawsuit right now over this, and
that's right,
allegedly, and his work has been, according to him, shadow banned by YouTube. he invested a lot of money into building this Prager Academy, and it's been shadow banned. So, this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. But the problem with that, yeah, please.
I'm sorry. I say it's important to emphasize those are not government organizations. So
Right.
the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. So they can restrict speech on their platforms. It's a private platform. They can restrict whoever they want from it. And if you don't like it, you can make an you can create your own platform. That's what a free market ultimately is for. The example of this was last year, YouTube began banning or restricting access to pro-gun videos, gun enthusiast videos. And so there was an alternative website, Live 30, I think it's called, started to feature gun videos. The same has been true with Twitter. There's now a kind of conservative version of Twitter that is getting some following. The president is even considering starting an account. I heard there was a news story recently about that. So you can create an alternative platform if you don't like it, or you can internally, push them to change. But you can't use the government to force these private institutions to allow access to views that they disagree with.
Well, yeah, I mean, for example, Alex Jones has been completely deplaned. I mean, he's been removed, and because he's been deemed as involved in conspiracy theories or whatnot. And but the problem I have with it, and this is a conundrum, because I agree that these are private institutions. They have a right to have their own standards for whatever reason they want. But they've become so dominant in the media, and they have such an ability to influence. I mean, the last election, it's now come out that they were shadow banning Republican candidates for Congress, including Linda Blackburn, who won her election in Tennessee, had her site removed for several weeks, right as the election was nearing. I mean, doesn't this get into an issue of that these organizations, even though they're private, they're almost the equivalent of a public utility?
Yeah, I would disagree with that pretty sharply. I mean, if I would suggest you take a look at MySpace or Friendster or any of the many sites that once seemed dominant on the internet that lost out to competitors like Facebook. The internet is a free market. Competition rises, and I think you see Facebook and other social media platforms actually calling for more regulation because they know that would cement their position as the dominant player in the market. When you increase regulation, when you increase government involvement, you're ultimately stifling innovation and generation of new ideas. And so what we need is fair competition. If you don't like Facebook's policies, you can go to a different platform. They really are not. I mean, they're pretty ubiquitous, but they're not actually a monopoly. There is always free choice on the internet, and when the government gets in the way, it's actually going to create less choice and less freedom on the internet.
Well, the question is, are they almost a monopoly at this point? I mean, Facebook owns YouTube. They own an amazing number of outlets that we don't even realize they own. And, is this a situation which could be looked at by the government as an antitrust problem?
Yeah, I would argue against that. Again, I think that you look again at MySpace, the fact that was once the dominant player in social media, and it fell within just a couple of years in the face of Facebook and Twitter and others. I think there's still room for a lot of innovation in the internet. Facebook is dominant. It does have a lot of market share and power, but I think there are other competitors that rise up all the time, and I think innovation will ultimately create a better, fair, a more free and valuable internet than government regulation ever could.
And I also think that the whole idea of criminalizing so-called hate speech is a complete contradiction to our American system of jurisprudence. We don't criminalize speech or thought. We criminalize action. If you're going to start to criminalize people's thoughts or speech, which is something that can legitimately be used as evidence in a trial, if a crime is committed, that's where it's appropriate to go to motive and to go to evidence.
Right.
But if you're going to criminalize the speech itself, that gets into what they do in communist China. I mean, that's political crimes. China apparently executes, according to Amnesty International, something like 50,000 people a year for political crimes, not actual crimes, because they were against the government, or because they were politically incorrect, or because they said something or looked a certain way that was not officially sanctioned.
There's a really dangerous idea that has gained ground in Europe and starts to gain ground in the United States, which is that if something is offensive to you, it is a form of violence. So if I offend you, if I challenge your identity, if I challenge your beliefs, or this is especially prominent in the LGBT rights context with sexual orientation, if I say something that offends your identity or yourself, that is an act of violence to your person. And that is a very, very dangerous idea. If we follow that idea, then that leads, I think, instinct to that kind of censorship. If we say, well, you said something and it was violent, it was harmful, it was so offensive that we have to say you hurt someone and we have to punish you for it, that we have to reject really forcefully. That is again contrary to the founders' idea, which was that we were resilient individuals, that we could take being offended, take hearing ideas we disagree with, and still participate in civil society with those that we disagree with sharply. If we move to the idea that that is violence against someone else, then we are really knocking on the door of censorship and that kind of hate of crime for your thoughts, which is really frightening.
Yes, and I think that even though they're private institutions, there are a lot of American colleges that are moving in that direction in terms of creating what they call safe spaces and
Right.
banning certain speech because and you've got students who are like literally, I can mention cases where they got teachers and professors fired because they signed a document or because they said something that was not politically correct. They were drummed off the campus. And while a college is a private institution and they have a right to set certain codes,
Right.
the fact that they would capitulate to this kind of fascistic tendency among their own students sets a bad precedent, I would argue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we really need to. I love Greg Lukiano's book Unlearning Liberty. His that book about the idea or the coddling of the American mind. I think is his later book. Sorry, that is this idea that our generation is currently not being taught to be resilient or to take offense and bounce back from it. To say, well, I disagree with you, and we can disagree and we can still coexist. We can still get along with one another. Today, where I think people are being taught from a very young age that if someone disagrees with you, you cannot associate with them. You have to hate them. You have to exclude them and censor them, and that's very dangerous. And that starts from a very young age. I think from this in schooling, we're not being taught these ideals, the civic ideals. I think of free speech, the
Right.
foundational principle that we live in a society where we disagree with one another. We can sharply disagree. We can boycott. We can protest. We can do all kinds of things. But ultimately, we have to coexist together as one American people. United in this great republic of ours, and I think those ideals are not being taught from a very young age.
Oh, absolutely, and certainly the college campus is supposed to be a venue by which very sharply differing ideas are debated and discussed, not a soapbox for a particular ideology that forces conformity. Anyway,
Exactly.
Daniel, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Daniel Ortner is an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. Daniel, do you want my viewers and listeners to know where they can reach you and your group?
Sure. Our website is pacificlegal.org. We have all information about all of our cases. We are constantly fighting the government and winning in order to defend individual liberty, free speech, economic freedom. Come look at our website. You can see all of our cases and all the great work that we're doing.
And I certainly congratulate you guys for working in California. All right. Thanks a lot, Daniel.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.